Right, Femi, what is tip number 2, please?
Okay, so tip number 2 is focus on explanations, not resources. And this is quite an interesting one, and it's in no way criticising, what you do with your podcast or my podcast that I do, or any books that you can read or Twitter. But I do think there's a big problem in education with teachers spending too long discussing resources and not enough time discussing pure pedagogy. And I think that actually a lot of teachers incorrectly think that a pedagogical discussion is a discussion about websites and whether or not you use MathsWatch or My Maths or Corbett Maths or Pixie Maths or whatever. And all that's got a purpose, and it all needs to be discussed. And there are definitely some things that are better than others to use in a maths lesson. But actually, real pedagogy, in my opinion, is discussing how we're transmitting what we know as mathematicians and maths teachers into the minds of the pupils. And that's more about how you're explaining things. Because I actually believe that the resources are just like a sort of a tool of practice for the pupils. And I've been to see lessons, I can think of one teacher in my second school who used to use some resources that nobody would touch now. He always used this book called Elvin Revision and Practice, and it was this really dusty old book from the 1970s, and he had to photocopy it and blow up the photocopier so that it was big enough because there were these tiny little exercises. But you'd go into his class and watch him teach, and he was an absolute expert, and you could hear a pin drop, and the kids were on it and working well and loving their maths and focusing and working really hard because he'd got his explanations absolutely watertight. And I actually went to another school quite recently just for the day to have a look at what they were doing. This is a private school, really quite expensive private school. And every lesson I walked into, I wanted to steal their resources because they were really good. And you could say, oh, where'd you get this from? But actually the explanations and the pedagogy of their teaching was quite poor, and the kids actually weren't making much progress. So I really do believe that we need to talk about explanations less than we talk about resources. And actually, in my last school, I head department, just for 1 or 2 years, we had a really, really strong team, and we really got this, and we had a lot of what I call sitting on tables, which is when after school you could walk down the corridor and there'd be maths teachers just sat on the table talking to each other, and they'd be saying things like, yeah, Craig, I was teaching rationalising the denominator this morning, and I started with an example that had 3 plus root 5 on the bottom. I didn't go very well. What would you do? Oh, no, I'd never do that. Let me show you what I use. I always start with this example because it helps them to link it to normal. Oh, right. That's what I think pedagogy is, not, exchanging worksheets and talking about apps and things like that.
This is nice. I love this one. Right, okay, so let's dive into this a little bit. So first, just a very quick reflection. I often hear teachers, whether it's in person or on Twitter, you often get the question, have you got anything good on this? So I'm teaching straight lines. Have you got anything good on straight lines? Or have you got anything good on this? And again, you're absolutely right. It's always resource focused. So I completely agree with you that the emphasis is always on resources. The other thing, well, there's a few things I'm interested in here. I think there's a difference between that explanation, but also something else you picked up on, which is the choice of example. And sometimes even you can have the best explanation in the world, but if that choice of example's wrong, either kids are going to overgeneralise or they're going to pick up on something that shouldn't be there. So there's two parts to it, isn't there, Femi? There's getting how you're going to explain it, but before that, what example are you going to choose to start with? And that feels like a big part of this.
Absolutely, and I just don't. Even in schools I've worked in recently, I just don't hear enough conversations about this stuff, because it can win or lose a lesson knowing what to pick, what examples to go with, how many examples to do, how to understand when the kids have got that look in their eyes when, you've got this, okay, we can do some practice now, or no, I think you need one more example on this, so we need one more, guys, okay, one more. That is where, when I go and watch lessons, I see them being won or lost. It's not on it's rarely on the example of the teacher, the exercises that the teachers are using, because there's so much stuff out there now.
This is really interesting. So another reflection. I see a lot of departmental meetings when I visit schools. I'm obsessed with departmental meetings, and what you often see in there is that they're admin central, and that's a disaster waiting to happen. It's all about discussions about targets and so on. Whenever you shift the emphasis more to, in inverted commas, pedagogy, what that pedagogy often looks like is what you're describing, where it's not a discussion on explanations. It's, okay, here's a good resource I've used for straight line graphs. Here's a good resource I've used for sequences. So I wonder, what does an effective pedagogy-focused departmental meeting look like for you, Femi?
Oh, Craig, brilliant chat. I love that question. And my honest answer to that is I'm still working on it. And it's still one area in my leadership that I want to get better at. But we have now got to a point in my school where we have what I call no non-admin meetings. So there is absolutely zero admin discussed at all. And it's really interesting, actually, because when I first started doing it, I knew that people probably would be a bit uncomfortable with that. So I used to say I used to put on the agenda at the end, item 3, admin discussion. And people would often at the end in item 3 say, right, okay guys, really good meeting, anything for item 3, admin? People would often just feel quite uncomfortable and they say something like, can we just discuss the year 9 target grades? Are we going to still go with the higher grade that we did? And I put that in the email. We're still going to do that. Still going to be the same as the email I sent yesterday. About okay, good. And actually, and I feel, and over time, people stop doing that. And now I still put it on there, but everyone just goes, no, fine, lunch, we're done now, and we move on. So there's lots of things I've tried. I would say the most effective thing that I've done that I really like doing is recording lessons. And actually on the board, and it's so easy to do now with an iPad, just having an example of someone teaching a lesson from our department to our kids, and asking the team to do 3 things. Firstly is write down one thing that you thought that was effective, one thing that you noticed, and one question you would have for the teacher. And it's quite a vulnerable place to put someone. And I've deliberately started with people that I know won't have a problem with that, and I'm quite confident in their practice, because I think it's, ideally we want everyone to do this, but it really is opening us up to, right, we're really going to discuss what's really happening in the lessons. We're not just going to talk about, oh, my 8's terrible today, they couldn't do straight line graph, oh, mine was the same. This is a pointless conversation because we can't see what happened. And actually, one person's bad lesson is another person's great lesson.
This is great. I love this. Final question on this, Femi. As a head of department, how concerned are you with consistency of explanation and examples across your team? And I'm just thinking, if you have this discussion, this pedagogical discussion, perhaps you start drawing out, okay, this is a really good way of explaining this is a good example. Are you then happy for teachers to then make their own mind up about whether they use that?
It's really interesting you say. So when I started at the school I'm at now, I really wanted to have a real drive on pedagogy, and I knew that as a department we weren't yet ready to start talking about we're all going to teach expanded double brackets in the same way. We're all going to teach Pythagoras in the same way. There was variation across the school, across the department. But actually, I think that the general pedagogy of things like recap starters and when the kids are talking, or you're talking, the kids are silent, all that sort of stuff needed addressing before we got to that. We're now at a point where we're starting to think about, actually, as I go around the department, as I do a lot, I do see lots of different methods being used for things, and we do need to start bringing that together. Because there's no point in year 10 having pupils who have been taught 6 different ways of doing something, because the teacher in year 10 is going to have to try to unpick that. So we are now starting to talk about, let's have some uniformity over the way that we're explaining things. But it's by no means PowerPoints. It's by no means email out the PowerPoints and you just go through that and it's all on there. I'm actually quite against that. I don't like that. I'm for teachers to start planning their own lessons and deciding how they're going to show things. I was really pleased when I listened to your pod and we had Adam Boxer on. He was talking about modelling. You must model rather than click, click, click. So they can explain it how they like, but I think we do need to have some kind of uniformity over how we're going to do it so that it's consistent as they go up to school.
Got it.